Hi everybody, this is my third sermon for this class. The title of this message would be What the Lord Requires of You. And my reading is taken from Deuteronomy chapter 10 from verses 12 through 22. And now Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? He requires you to fear him, to live according to his will, to love and worship him with all your heart and soul, and to obey the Lord's commands and laws that I am giving you today for your own good. The highest heavens and the earth and everything in it all belongs to the Lord, your God. Yet the Lord chose your ancestors as the objects of his love, and he chose you, their descendants, above every other nation, as is evident today. Therefore, cleanse your sinful hearts and stop being stubborn. The Lord your God is the God of gods, the Lord of lords. He is the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality or takes no bribes. He gives justice to orphans and widows. He shows love to foreigners, to the foreigners living among you, and gives them food and clothing. You too must show love to foreigners, for you yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. You must fear the Lord your God and worship him and cling to him. Your oaths must be in his name alone. He is your God, the one who is worthy of your praise, the one who has done mighty miracles that you yourselves have seen. When your ancestors went down to Egypt, there were only 70, but now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars in the sky. So there are a few things that come into play looking at the reading we have done here. First of all, it talks about fearing the Lord our God. And to fear here doesn't mean just to be afraid. It talks more about worshiping God, about being in awe of him, being in reverence of the Lord. Secondly, it talks about walking with God, to live each and every day in all his ways and to love him. The third portion here talks about serving the Lord with all our heart, with all our soul, and to live according to his will. And fourthly, we see there's a commandment that the Lord has given to uphold his statutes. He's commanding us to do good every day. So there are four major components in the book of Deuteronomy, which I would mention here. First of all, there's the notion of a one God who is to be worshipped, and no other God is to be worshipped except Yahweh. Secondly, there's one people. One people are the people who are chosen by God, the people of Israel. Thirdly, there's a covenant which is more of an agreement. It's a commitment and a promise to which both Israel and Yahweh were bound to. And then fourthly, there was a land. And this land is where Yahweh would be worshipped. It's a land that is flowing with milk and honey. So just to give you a background of where we're coming from in the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy is one which is said to be more of a deathbed speech by Moses, which he was giving the children of Israel. These are not really new laws, but they are more of a reiteration or retelling of these laws. So Moses was more of hatching out and retelling the laws that were already laid out for the children of Israel. And thirdly, just to kind of give a general idea, Israel was being reminded here to be faithful to God, who has led them from Egypt through their journey in the wilderness, and as they're approaching the promised land, which unfortunately in the case of Moses, he wasn't going in with them. So the greatest command, which is one that is found in Deuteronomy, which again is a rehash of the commands that were given, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and your mind and your soul and with all your strength. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself is the second command that was emphasized. This would be found in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. And when we follow along in this line, we would see that Jesus in the book of Mark, chapter 12, verses 30 to 31, reiterated this when someone came to him and asked him, "Master, what is the greatest commandment that you have given?" He said, "The greatest command is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is similar to this, is to love your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus rounded up by saying that this is the greatest commandment because there's no greater command like this. So the question then arises, who is your neighbor? In this situation, we have the 10 Commandments where we can reference to. In the later portion of the 10 Commandments, we see there's a whole list of items where the Jewish laws at that time that were given were directly towards a neighbor. And a neighbor in that sense is more of talking to the children of Israel about the people who they live with, who they are with, and that would be people who live around them. But is that really what a neighbor is? We see the story of the Good Samaritan as well in the New Testament in Luke chapter 10, starting from verses 25 through 37, where we see a person who was robbed and beaten and almost at the point of death, who a couple people came and passed by. They didn't help him, but someone who was thought to be his enemy ended up helping him. So when the question was posed, who then amongst those three people would be the victim's neighbor? And we can see clearly that it's not just the people who live around us, because in our neighborhood here, we have people who live around us, and we call them by the term neighbor. So a neighbor in this case, looking at this precedence, is not just one that is who lives close to you. One other thing that was stated in Deuteronomy, which we see a theme of, would be caring for the needy. In this instance, it's got to be with caring for the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan. And why this category of people? So caring for the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan is one which is mentioned 11 times in Deuteronomy as a triad. The foreigner apparently is mentioned almost 21 times by itself, where the people were instructed or commanded to love the foreigner and take care of the foreigner. So these are some of the verses where we can make reference to the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan, where they're mentioned and where they've been instructed and commanded to love these individuals. For some reason, quite interestingly, this set of people are mentioned alongside the needy, and the poor, and the destitute. So the instructions there are mostly for food to be provided to them, for clothing to be provided to them, and to ensure that they receive justice too. With regards to food particularly, there's one of the verses that mentioned where they should be allowed to glean after the children of Israel have harvested. So the children of Israel were instructed not to harvest everything, but to have it at the back of their minds that there are people who are needy within the community. And the foreigners were part of those people who were supposed to be looked after and cared for. So how does this then apply to us today? If we look at the instances here, looking back, some people might think this is just applicable to the children of Israel because Moses was talking to the children of Israel. And as we have seen, there is particularly a covenant that is in place between Yahweh and the children of Israel. So we would think that, or some might think that, this doesn't apply to us. And how would you respond to that? So if we look at references from the New Testament, and if we look at our present situation in this contemporary world, we might not have a replication of what is at that time. Because when we look back and look at the history of humanity and the history of the present, or the history of the U.S., we would be aware that during those times, the man was mainly the provider in the home. So when the man passed away, it left the burden to the woman. And in the circumstances of an orphan who has lost both parents, they would be in need of provision of their daily needs. So that is why these set of people were put along with the poor and the needy. So we see a reference for feeding the hungry, clothing those who need clothes, and inviting strangers to be with us in Matthew. We see a setting of setting the oppressed free, looking for the interests of others, making sure they receive justice, and making sure they receive the necessities of life. There's also a common in Acts where the people gathered, where we see a reference of the first believers, of Christians, we would say, where they shared everything in common, where whoever had something went ahead and whoever had something sold it and distributed what they got from that amongst other people, so they would all have it together. So they gave to the needy, they provided for them, and in Acts 4, from verses 32 to 37, we see a repetition of that as well. So with that being said, one of the biggest impacts that I think one of the greatest verses was, or would be, in James 1, starting from James 1:26. And James 1:26 says that pure and lasting religion in the sight of God, our Father, means that we must care for orphans and widows in their troubles and refuse to let the world corrupt us. So this is a huge command, as we see a reoccurrence of this instruction, a recurrence of this guidance that is provided both in the Old Testament in Deuteronomy and in the New Testament. And in the words of Jesus, when he was encouraging people around to take care of people, he said on the last day, people would be crying, "Oh Lord, when did we see you needy and didn't help you? When did we see you without clothes and didn't clothe you?" And the response that Jesus gave them was that, "If you did it to any of these least amongst you, you have done it to us." So we have been called to be the light of the world. we have been called to be the salt of the earth. So what good is the salt if it doesn't, if it's not able to preserve, or it's not able to make or give taste to the world? So we have been called on a mission to be that for the world. And we have been called to be an extension of God here on earth. As we especially look closer home as to what is happening today, how can we make that effective in our lives? We have people all around us, and unfortunately, there has been lockdowns because of this COVID-19 circumstances. So we would ask ourselves, how can we then be the salt of the world? How can we be effective in our Christian faith? How can we extend a hand to those who are referred to as our neighbors here? So we have to be cautious of what we have. Unfortunately, we've heard about millions of people applying for unemployment. Some people are out of work because they cannot go anywhere. A lot of businesses are shut down. A lot of people have lost their jobs, and people are not able to sustain. We thank God because we are in a position where, for me personally, I'm able to work. I give God all the glory. But again, that comes with a challenge. How can we shine our light? How can we be that salt? So what does the Lord then require of us? The Lord requires us to live godly. And living godly is not just refraining from committing those serious sins that we can get penalized by, those penal laws. The Lord requires us to care for the vulnerable in the society, to care for those who are orphans, who are fatherless, to care for widows, and to care for sojourners and the poor. And if we look back at the references of these individuals during that time and during that context, we would see that it is very likely that those people are not able to provide for themselves. That might not be the case today, but regardless of that, we have people around us who are needy. We have people around us that could see an extension of God in us. So we have to keep an eye on the society and pay attention to our community. So when we abide by these stipulations as extended in these readings we've seen and in these encouragements we've received, we will be certain that the promise of the Lord would be with us. We would be rewarded, and we will live a fulfilling life and a blessed life. There's nothing more interesting than that, to know that we are the light of this world. We are the salt, and we are an extension of God the Father. He has sent us with a huge commission and a commandment to go and take his gospel to the world. So that is what I think the Lord requires of us. Thank you, and stay blessed.